Okay, we're ready to go. I'm muting everyone. Rabbi, please unmute. And we're ready to go.
Great. So it's good to see you all, and I hope you managed to find The Quarrel on Vimeo. That's not necessarily our preferred choice for how to see these movies, but when I did the original research on what movies we were going to watch this quarter, it was still available on Amazon for rent, and then it must have just gone off, like just a week or two before we got to it, which is too bad. The print on Vimeo was not great, gotta say, but I will say that this is one of the rare movies that we've watched where the visual is probably not quite as important as the audio. I mean, it is the movie is based on a short story by a Yiddish author, Chaim Grade. It was originally published in 1951, and the title of the story is only slightly different from the movie My Quarrel with Hirsch Rassiner, it's called. So the author, Chaim Grade, in a sense, puts himself in the position of the other character, Chaim Kovler. Right. So so that was written in 1951. Is that Chaim Grade? I wouldn't recognize him if I ran into him. But he was
from his Wikipedia article, this is him.
Yeah. So he a little bit older than Isaac Bashevis Singer, whose work we've become familiar with, having watched Gentle and Enemies: A Love Story. But Chaim Grade wrote this. He's a lot harder to find in English translation than I.B. Singer, although probably on the internet you could probably track that down somewhere. The short story was turned into a play by Joseph Telushkin. And Telushkin's name may be familiar to you. He was born in 1948. He's raised in Brooklyn. He went to the Flatbush Yeshiva and got his smicha as a rabbi from Yeshiva University. He's been on the list of 50 most influential rabbis since 1997. He actually has been a rabbi in Los Angeles for a number of years. He was the rabbi of what's known as the Synagogue for the Performing Arts, which has been around in the area of not too far from Santa Monica, California, a little south of Santa Monica. Been around for 60, 70 years maybe. And Telushkin's been the rabbi there for a while. So he turned this into a play, and then a guy named David Brandis, who's a Canadian producer, writer, and director, turned it into a screenplay. So most of the dialogue stays the same. It's more about, what were stage directions become kids playing in the background in the park, walking through the forest, those kinds of things. So opening up the play a little bit to be a movie, so that it's not entirely confined to a park bench, which was most of what the stage play would have been. So in addition to writing this play, Joseph Telushkin has written a couple of other TV shows and things like that. He worked on a few episodes of a series called Touched by an Angel, which some of you may remember. He wrote an episode of The Practice. He was involved with a TV show called Twice in a Lifetime, which I actually don't recall. But so he was around doing some of these things. But he's really best known for his scholarly works in Judaism. We use one of his books every time we do an Introduction to Judaism class. He wrote a pretty thick book that we give to all of the students in Intro to Judaism called Jewish Literacy. So he and his main work is a 2-volume set on Jewish ethics. So he is a quite influential rabbi. and I think much more influential for his scholarly work than perhaps for this film and the other screenplays that he's written. Um, Chaim Grade, the author of the original story, was born in Vilnius. He died in the Bronx. He had a yeshiva education when he was young, but becomes secular as he gets older. He fled Lithuania during World War II to the Soviet Union. And after the Second World War, he lived in Poland and then France and then finally the United States in 1948. So in 1932, he published his first story. He was, so this is before the war when he was living in Vilnius. So he was part of Young Vilna, which is a kind of an experimental group of artists back in Europe before the Shoah. So, the producer, the screenwriter, David Brandis, is Canadian, as I mentioned. He's on the board of the Center for Jewish Culture and Creativity in Canada. He was nominated for the Canadian Academy Award. We call our Academy Awards the Oscars. They call theirs the Genies. So he was nominated for a Genie Award for this movie, actually. Other than that, this movie doesn't really have any particular, nominations for anything, but I still think it's a pretty compelling movie. And I have to say, I've seen it now probably 4 times. Watching it for the 4th time for this series, and I like it better each time I watch it. I mean, to be honest, the first time I was not so impressed. So if you're not impressed, maybe you should watch it again. It's a pretty interesting movie. It is certainly a movie of ideas, right? It's not really a drama in the sense of having a kind of a dramatic arc through the movie. More a series of scenes than something that has a big arc. The director of this movie is Eli Cohen, who is actually Israeli. He acts and directs in Israel. His movie Summer of Avia won the Silver Bear at the Berlin Film Festival, which is a pretty high honor. So he's a pretty distinguished director. The stars, one of them you might recognize under his long dark beard. Is that Eli Cohen?
Yeah, he's the second one. The first
Yeah,
Eli
right.
Cohen.
You gotta make sure you're not mixing him up with Eli Cohen, the spy.
Right. This is him in the big
Okay.
picture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, pretty common name, Eli Cohen. You may remember there's actually, I think it might even be on Netflix. There's a mini series about Eli Cohen, the spy, with the star of Borat, Sacha Baron Cohen, playing.
It's fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Yeah. So, but Eli Cohen, the actor and director, is a different guy. And I was starting to talk about the 2 main actors in this movie. One you may recognize because he certainly has been in a lot of American movies. His name is Saul Rubinek. He plays the journalist in Unforgiven, who's kind of writes sort of pulp novels, pulp versions of Western stories in the movie Unforgiven, directed by Clint Eastwood. He's in movies that you may have seen, like Against All Odds, Wall Street, True Romance, which was a screenplay by Quentin Tarantino. He's been in quite a few things. He's actually in the Amazon series from last year with Al Pacino, Hunters. So if you've watched that one, you've seen him in one of his most current roles. This is not the only movie where he plays a rabbi. There's a movie we used to show to young teens somewhere around their B'nai Mitzvah, typically, called The Outside Chance of Maximilian Glick, a Canadian movie about a a boy studying for his bar mitzvah, and Saul Rubinek plays his tutor in that movie as well. Right. Um, so Elaine's asking what language were the subtitles in. Does anybody know? I couldn't place it. I mean, I was trying to figure it out too. Maxine, do you know? You have
You're
to unmute.
muted.
We think it might have been Yiddish.
No, it wasn't Yiddish for
Was it
sure.
Yiddish?
No.
Definitely not.
So maybe,
Yiddish is written in Hebrew.
well, typically, but I mean, it's sometimes in transliteration also,
Yeah.
but it wasn't Yiddish, because that I would have recognized. You know, and I thought, you know, I thought maybe German, but it wasn't German. You know, I mean, looking for things. Recognize a couple of people are suggesting Dutch. Possibly, not sure why. You know, I mean, we have no idea really who put it up on Vimeo. I don't think, and we're just lucky that somebody did, in a sense, so that we could watch it. But certainly not any of the languages you would expect. I mean, it's you know, so not Yiddish. Not
Leo is suggesting Afrikaans that has Dutch in it.
Okay, maybe Afrikaans could be, you know, a language I know nothing about, you know, so it wouldn't look like anything to me. So, so we were talking about Saul Rubinek, who was actually born in a displaced person camp in 1948 in Europe to Polish Jewish parents, and they emigrated to Canada. So he grew up from a very young age in Canada, but from parents who were displaced by the war, right? Survivors of the Holocaust. The other actor does not appear to be Jewish, as far as I can tell. His name is Robert Holmes Thompson. His biography seems to scrupulously avoid talking about religion. It's interesting. There's a lot else about him. He's well known in Canada. He's actually received the Order of Canada Award, which is sort of like a knighthood would be in England. So he has been in other movies that have some Jewish content to them, but as far as I can tell, he himself is not Jewish. He was born in 1947 in a suburb of Toronto, essentially, I think, Richmond Hill. So, you know, some things you could search out if you wanted to see him in something else. He plays a diamond merchant who saves Austrian Jews in a kind of a Canadian version of Schindler's List, in a way. It's called Charlie Grant's War. He plays Charlie Grant in that. He's also, there was this ran on PBS a while back. Maybe some of you saw it, a documentary called Hollywoodism. It was based on Neil Gabler's book, An Empire of Their Own, how the Jewish movie moguls invented Hollywood. So the documentary based on it was called Hollywoodism, and R.H. Thompson was the narrator for that. So so a couple of things that he's done that are of Jewish interest. But I can't find out too much about his personal life. And as I said, every source I looked at sort of avoided any, you know, a lot of the actors and directors and things we've looked at, you know, they go out of their way to say things like the son of a rabbi or the child of survivors or something, and his biographical sketches, wherever they appear, don't. So I don't know what to make of that. Certainly, if you were going just by his name, Robert Holmes Thompson, it wouldn't jump out at you the way Saul Rubinek might, you know. So nevertheless, he plays this role very credibly, I think, and the two of them make a pretty dynamic pair for a couple of people who are essentially just walking around a park talking to each other. So it's not easy to dramatize a movie like this, right? And there aren't that many of them that get made when you come right down to it. I mean, if you want to think about sort of parallels to a movie like this, you might have to think about something like My Dinner with Andre, if you remember that one. You know, something that's essentially about ideas and two people talking. So, but we do have here in this plot, I think it's quite lovely, really. You know, a chance encounter between two people who were once very close and don't even know that the other one is alive when this begins. So our movie begins in Montreal. It's interesting that it's Montreal and not Toronto in a sense. Now part of this is that Montreal at this time, which would have been, you know, it takes place not that long after the war, right? So late 40s, I think it's set. So this is before the Quebecois movement got really hit full steam in Montreal. So there was actually a very large Jewish population in Montreal. Since Quebec has become much more French in recent years, a lot of those Jews that used to live in Montreal have moved. Some of them have emigrated to the United States. There's a large population of Jews from Montreal living in South Florida, for example. And there is, and a lot of them moved to areas around Toronto. So the Toronto Jewish community is much larger than the Montreal Jewish community. And there is, I think, you know, the movie is set in Montreal for just a touch of irony. You know, I think it's the line that Chaim Kovler says to him is, Hirsch Rassiner, Rav Hirsch Rassiner is living in a city with a cross in the middle, right? Because of course, if you've been to Montreal, you know that the Central Park essentially, and you see the cross early in the movie, is Mont Royal, which is where Montreal gets its name, and at the top of Mont Royal is a cross. So it's an interesting sort of, you know, that these two are both in Montreal kind of a fish out of water in a certain sense, right? That of all places they should run into each other there, rather than say New York or someplace where there's a larger, you know, Jewish population is kind of an interesting thing. And of course, the whole plot is put into motion by fate, right? In this movie, right? You know, the author, Chaim Kovler, wakes up in a Montreal hotel room. He's there. He gave a reading the night before, and he's going to give a reading the next day of his Yiddish writing, and realizes that it's Rosh Hashanah, and that even though he hasn't been a practicing Jew in a long time, it's the first time that he's completely forgotten that it's Rosh Hashanah. And he goes to a diner to have some bacon and eggs, and a man staring at him in the window realizes that this is the guy I need to ask to be the 10th in our minyan. Right? So there is a lot, you know, some of this may go past you a little bit, but of course, eating bacon is forbidden. We all know that. You also can't smoke on holy days and on Shabbat, right? The lighting of the match would be breaking a taboo of Shabbat and holy days, right? So there is a lot in this movie about he keeps taking cigarettes out and not lighting them, right? You know, not wanting to offend on one level, but perhaps still holding some superstition, let's say, about this in his heart a little bit. But so there's a lot of that, and so when he sees this guy looking at him, it puts him off his food. He doesn't eat the bacon, right? He gets up to leave, takes out a cigarette, doesn't light it, and this man asks him to be a 10th in the minyan. And he goes saying, I don't know why I went. I don't believe in this. You know, he just does it because he does it. And when he gets there, he hears a voice, right? And the voice is his old friend, Hirsch Rassiner, who is the head of a yeshiva in Montreal, but he himself on Rosh Hashanah comes to be the 10th man in the minyan and is told, well, we don't need you, we got 10, right? But thank you for coming. And that puts these things into motion. And so Chaim and Hirsch get to talking to each other. Right? We have a little bit of voiceover in the movie. Mostly we have the dialogue between the two. In voiceover, Chaim Kovler refers to him as my dearest friend, my bitterest enemy, which is sums up in some way the kind of ambivalence that these two have. And I just, as I say, I think, it could easily be a movie of ideas that's so dry, but the two actors, I think, managed to inject this life into their parts. And the screenplay is just wise enough to humanize them in various spots. I mean, there's a moment early on when they're talking about everybody who they knew is dead, right? And they come up with one guy, Yissel alive, he's in Australia. And they both start to laugh that Yissel's in Australia. I mean, it's just how strange the world is. And, so they have these moments where the characters really get humanized. They're not just ideas. They're not just the atheist versus the believer, and I think that those moments are quite lovely and touching when they come up. And so there are many lovely little touches like that, and nice scenes, moments of their competitive nature, right? I like the scene where they get into an argument about whether or not it's going to rain, proving that these two can argue about anything. And it's even the weather. And at one point, Kovler says to him, "I thought you said it doesn't rain in Canada or in Montreal." And he says, "To tell you the truth, I'm surprised." Okay. And then they find their way to a kind of a horse barn within the park, and of course the door is locked or jammed or something, and the rabbi walks away, and Kovler manages to get in. And when he comes back, he asks him, "How did you get in?" And he says, "It was a miracle." Okay. And so the two of them are able to sit down and stay dry for a while, where they eat an apple, which of course is highly symbolic. And it's Rosh Hashanah. What are we supposed to eat? Apples, right? Apples and honey. So they find an apple probably there for a horse. And most of us would just bite the apple, right? But they don't. He has to skin the apple. You know why he has to skin the apple? Because he's making it kosher, right? You don't know what that apple is touched, right? So he has to skin the apple, and then they can eat the inside. So, so even though he's the one who's the atheist, right? He's the one who's koshering the apple for him and his friend. And so a lot of beautiful little details as you watch the movie that they're quite interesting. And so I love those things. The little dig he gets in about how Kovler's first short story was really Hamlet, and now he's figured that out, right? But then the ideas themselves are so remarkable, this argument between belief and not belief. How do you come out of the Shoah and believe on the one hand, and how do you come out of the Shoah and not believe on the other, right? And they walk around and they illustrate these ideas in a variety of ways. peppering their talk with memories from the yeshiva and arguments about how they've hurt each other over the years. Right? It feels like a real conversation to me, so uh, I mean, I could go on and on with the various little scenes that I like. I mean, it's the other thing that I think is beautifully symbolic is this idea of Rav Yaakov's nigun, right? A nigun is a song without words, right? We occasionally use them at the beginning of services or at other times where we just ask people to sing a syllable, la la, ya ya, da da, whatever syllable comes to mind. And it's really a Hasidic tradition primarily. This song without words, and how without words we can still approach holiness and approach God, and maybe especially without words we can do that. And so, we never really do it as in the kind of serious way that the Hasidic tradition will do it, well, where they will sing for long periods of time these nigunim, right? And the two of them in the park trying to recall the nigun and the difficulty that they have trying to recall it, which finally near the end of the movie they manage to piece it together, the two of them. And they sing the nigun in the park in Montreal. They are transported in a certain sense, transported in space and time. When they finish singing the nigun, people have gathered around them and give them a round of applause. Right? They've been so transported that they don't know, what's where they are in the singing, and that's kind of the idea of the nigun, that it can be that transporting. We of course usually only sing it for a minute or two. You have to sing it for 20, 30 minutes, maybe more, right, till everybody's singing it, and you get that feeling of it. So it's that is kind of, that when it comes together towards the end, it's kind of a payoff. I'm also reminded as I watch this of there are all these Hasidic stories about rabbis that are lost in the forest. So I just think that there's little hints of that sort of thing. I mean, there's that moment where they come out, I think it's when they come out of the barn and they don't know which way to go. And they split up and go in different directions and end up in the same place, right? So I think this is partly they are competitive, right, with each other. So they both want to be right about the way, and they don't want to agree about the way. But once they find each other again, as this movie sort of has happened over and over, they find each other again, and now they still don't know which way to go to get out of the park, but they'll do it together, right? And so the movie has hardly anybody else but these two in it. A woman appears briefly who has spent the night with Chaim Kovar and left her necklace in his hotel room. So we have that scene. We have another man who is a writer or fancies himself a writer and is looking to have his work reviewed by Kovler. And we have the student from the yeshiva who shows up 2/3 of the way through the movie. And I think that scene's one of my favorites in the movie. I mean, when that young student shows up and tells both an extraordinarily poignant story about being left for dead in the concentration camp, and how even his brothers and his friends didn't come to save him, but his Rebbe, snuck under the wire and carried him on his back, right? I mean, an incredible story on the one hand, and then Kovler makes a very strong point when he says, well, what if it had been me? Would I be your Rebbe? What if it had been a Christian? Would you be a Christian now? right? It's a very powerful, powerful story, right? That leads to this question is, the Rebbe says, in another circumstance, I could teach them that the Torah has 70 faces, all different ways of looking at the world and all of these things, but we're in survival mode, essentially. The only way to survive, he says, is right, to teach them in this narrow way, right? And of course, Kovler's argument is just the opposite, that survival comes from loving others, from being open to the world rather than pushing back against it and running away from it. So I think in that sense, it illustrates one of the kind of central arguments in the Jewish community that persists to the present day, right? I mean, how does Judaism survive? We as liberal Jews, Reform Jews, we've essentially put our chips on Judaism survives through openness, right? Through understanding. And, the more ultra Orthodox, of course, see it just the opposite. The only survival of Judaism is in sort of purifying Judaism and this shutting off from the rest of the world, right? So I think it's a very interesting argument that we continue to talk about, right? The movie ends with a reference to the story of Joseph and a commentary on the story of Joseph, that Joseph, goes to Egypt, becomes powerful in Egypt, becomes second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. But until his brothers came, Joseph was alone. Right? That there's an inherent loneliness in being a Jew in the world, right? And that finding another, even another who you've had disagreements with in the past, even those you quarrel with, right, is a way of finding your brothers. And that's a very interesting coda, I'd say, to the end of the movies, to the end of the movie, which ends with a hug. He had everything, but until his brothers came, Joseph was alone. Right? So it becomes the coda for the movie. So I could go on and on with lots of other things, and I will if you guys don't have things to say, but I'd love to give you a chance. What did you think of it? What did you see? Any thoughts or questions?
Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple things. One, I just thought they did a beautiful job of depicting this friendship. These men grew up together, and in beautiful ways, they evoked, their friendship. And yes, they were competitive and they saw things differently. But at one point, I don't know if it was when they were going their different ways in the forest, or at another time, I thought that Chaim, he was just like so angry, he was just going to leave. But then I think he was so happy he had found Harris or whatever. And I think he really truly loved him. And I think they kind of completed each other in a way. I just thought it was beautiful. The only other comment is, I know you paired this movie, Rabbi, and I'm just thinking, even though this movie had, as you said, very little action, and it was mostly a dialogue, I think I got more out of this than I did out of, I'm forgetting the name of it, but The Chosen. I don't know, it just tugged at my heartstrings more than The Chosen. I don't know, that I just really, really enjoyed it very, very much.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I think you can see why I paired them. I mean, for a couple of reasons. I mean, both of them are about male friendship in some ways, which there are movies about that, but not that many. And from a Jewish perspective, perhaps even less, right? But so there's that, and of course also this sort of argument within Judaism, right? You know, so those are the two things that caused me to put them together. That in terms of why one might be more dramatically satisfying than the other, I mean, I think that perhaps the fact that these men are survivors adds a different dimension to it than the Chosen does. I mean, those are boys growing up in New York. The stakes are not quite the same, right? I mean, the moment when those two guys are talking about everybody who's dead, I mean, their whole families, everyone they knew, everybody they studied with, I mean, it's hard not to be overwhelmed in a sense by that, right? Which adds to the pathos in this movie, which I think does you know, make it dramatically satisfying in a sense that perhaps The Chosen is not. So I see, Izzy's got a hand up? You have to unmute.
Yes. I just wanted to know what audience were they aiming for and who watched it other than Jewish people?
Yeah, that's a really good question and always worth asking when it comes to movies like this. You wonder, like we've talked about this many times about some of these movies, like who decided to green light this movie, right? And say, yeah, let's spend $1 million making a movie, you know, because even low budget movies are still expensive. I don't know what the budget of this movie was. I mean, it's a Canadian production. I mean, it's there's probably actually some government money. The National Film Board of Canada subsidizes movie making in Canada. So so chances are that they took advantage of various kinds of grants, and it says something about the progressive nature of the Canadian government, both that they fund things like this and they've funded amazing movies over the years. You know, so it didn't have the same necessity to make back somebody's investment that American movies do. But you're right. I mean, the audience for this movie, I mean, it got a release in movie theaters in America. Hard to imagine that, you know, people other than Jews went to see it. So
And how long was it in the theaters? And I also wanted to ask you about
30 years old, this movie. It came out in 1991. So I can't say I remember. I didn't see any box office figures for it.
curious. Also about The Chosen. I was going to ask
Right.
that.
So-
That was
So
the same
we
kind
asked
of,
that question last week because that is an American movie. And so
Yeah.
an American movie producer decided that was bankable, right? They did their best by putting Robbie Benson in it, who was a teen heartthrob, you know, and presumably made it as cheaply as they could make it. You know, the actors in it probably did not get their biggest payday for it, you know, and actors are often willing to forgo a big payday for something they believe in and really want to do. So, you know.
but I think it's remarkable that that movie was made
Right.
for a small audience.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I mean, I learned a lot.
Right.
I thought it was
Yeah.
really
I mean,
pro and con. I thought the arguments were really great.
Right.
And at one time I agreed with one and one time I agreed with the other. The rationale was so fascinating.
Right. Yeah, I love that about the movie too, that there's you know, early on in the movie, I find myself siding with the Rabbi. And then as the movie goes on, I find myself siding with the writer. And, you know, it's very interesting how
Right.
the movie
Back and forth.
I think takes you there. Yeah. So, yeah, you know, like the fact that these movies exist, some of the movies that we've seen are little miracles in themselves, right? That somebody had the faith and the courage and the idea that that movies are art, right? Because movies are art and they're commerce, you know, everywhere around the world. And so it's hard to get someone to put money into a movie that, you know, when you can put your money into the Avengers and make $1 billion, right? Or you can put your money into something like this, and maybe you make your investment
On
back.
his way home, and
Right.
he'll be back in about
So,
like within 5 or 10 minutes.
So it's difficult to imagine, you know, the producers and the people, you know, it only comes from love, right? You know, I just love this. I have to see it made, right? And people do that. You know, Barbara Streisand making Yentl. I mean, yeah, she wanted it to make $1 billion, but she also loved that material so much that she was going to get it made, right? And the producer of Funny Girl, who was the son-in-law of Fanny Brice, right? You know, it wasn't necessarily going to be the biggest hit on Broadway. It was, but it wasn't necessarily going to be that. The people who made Fiddler on the Roof, right? These are tremendous chances that the people who make Spider-Man don't take, right? By and large.
Funny you mentioned Spider-Man because that was not successful on Broadway, but
It's true.
Julie, and I had to mute you, and then I think Maxine.
I was just going to make a small point that I thought it was so interesting how at some point they get to the heat of their argument and one of them would walk away and the other would just sit there a while and then eventually follow.
Yeah.
And the one who walked away never seemed to look back. I think he felt that he would be followed. And then another time, the other one walked away first and then he was followed. I think that the richness of their friendship was so well portrayed that they, after all of those years, they still knew each other from their childhood so well, even though they struggled with the differences that they had. But I just got such a kick out of it that first one walked away, then the other one walked away, but the other one, the one that, you know, left behind always followed.
Yeah. Yeah. Like there's an invisible rope between them in a way, right? Once they find each other again. It's just, and one can only imagine being in that situation, but finding someone who you thought was dead, you know, who, you know, when everyone you know is dead, and then finding that person, how can there not be something that binds you together, even when you disagree with each other 100%, you know? So this invisible line between them, it's kind of amazing.
Maxine, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on what the rabbi just said about those two. They are the only two alive, beside the Australian guy, who knew each other in the past. And I can't imagine not ever seeing anybody that I knew in the past. I just can't imagine how you would feel, even though their worldviews were really diametrically opposed. There was that bond because they knew each other from long ago. I also wanted to say something about the rabbi student, the young man who was so angry.
Yeah.
And that I was somewhat bothered by that he had so much hate for people who didn't see his view. Did the rabbi purposely instill that, or was that just him interpreting what he had been taught?
Well, we certainly don't know every word that he's been taught, right? But he certainly seems to have been taught that his Rebbe once knew a man who walked away from Judaism, and you know, terrible things happen. Yeah. You know, and so that Kovler says to him, "You've gotten a very skewed picture of me from your Rebbe." Okay. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's that what the Rebbe's been trying to teach him is that being out in the world is a bad thing for Jews, right? And so seeing this guy makes it, you know, that anger comes out towards him for being a Jew who's out in the world. Right?
Julie has a comment.
Mhm.
I think regarding the student, that it also highlights the relationship between the other two men, because even though they disagree so much, they have such a respectful discussion, even though, like I said before, at times one might walk away from the other. But when you show that against the student who only could be angry and not willing to listen. But here, as much as the rabbi had his strong views, they listened to each other.
Yeah. That conversation after you know, the student leaves, right, is kind of a remarkable conversation. Kovler speaks to the Rebbe and says, "You're crazy and cruel." And his response is, "We live in a broken world. We're devastated people. You know, we have to be this single-minded to preserve our people." And Kovler's response, and this is where I certainly feel myself on his side, he says, "We should treasure each other like a rare jewel. We should be tolerant." You know, and the Rebbe says there's the world on one side and the chosen people on the other. Right? God chose us. You know, he says, yeah, he chose us to be burned, slaughtered, and hanged. And he says, no, he chose us to keep the Torah. Right? And then he says this kind of remarkable thing that in the moment that a Nazi guard was kicking him, he says, if an angel would have come to me at that time and said, I can let you switch places. The guard will become you and you'll become the guard. He says, I couldn't have done it. Yeah. So, which is a really, again, a very powerful thing to say. And yet Kovler says to him, I don't believe you. When you have power, you'll use it. Right. So, so very interesting conversation there, I think.
Babs put in the chat, the thing she'll remember is when the rabbi said, pray with me, and Chaim says, I already did in 1938.
Yeah, that's
And,
right.
you know, that's, that also resonated. Barbara, go ahead. You need to unmute.
I found it very interesting at one point after, when they were finally walking away together, that the rabbi talked about being on the train with a woman. And I thought that was extremely a commentary on racism, because here's this woman who was disgusted with his dress, and he goes ahead and says, well, lady, I'm Amish. And then she says, well, that's okay. I apologize. And then he starts speaking to her in Yiddish. And I don't know if that would have been as compelling in 1991 as it is today, as a commentary on racism
Right.
and racist attitudes.
Yeah, 1991, maybe just a good Jewish joke, right? I mean, it's, you know,
Exactly.
1991. She's a Jewish woman who's sitting next to him on the train.
Right, and embarrassed.
That look like you know.
Right.
He says to me, you've mistaken me for somebody else. I'm Amish. And to which she says, oh, I love the Amish.
Right.
The way you're devoted to your people, you know. Right. So it's kind of a good Jewish joke in 1991, but it certainly does have this underpinning, right?
But here's this Rebbe who really doesn't defend himself. He says, you know, he makes it okay that she is anti progressive, and he doesn't defend himself for being who he is.
Right.
That kind of disturbed me too, when he's defending himself constantly with Kovler, and then he gives this little anecdote about his experience and denies his heritage in a way.
Yeah. There's somewhere in there, Kovler talks to him about, you have too much anger to be a saint. Right?
True.
And
That's true. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
getting an echo. Is everyone hearing that?
Yeah, sorry, Turks, I had to mute you because you're,
Okay,
don't know
that's
what
what's
it is.
causing it. Okay.
but if you have something else, you can put it in the chat.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
Carla,
Carla's hand up.
yeah. Carla, go ahead.
Hey.
Hi, sweetie.
You see the whole family's on, right?
Yeah, I see Leo.
And David and
Oh, I didn't
Enrique is
see
sitting
David.
next to me.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
The movie was disturbing to me. I'm so grateful to have been invited to see it and then invited to hear you bring up scenes here and there. I find myself with so much disrespect in general for the Orthodox observant community. So I found the rabbi's case very unmoving for the most part, and I am unwavering in my attitude towards people making miracles happen as opposed to God making miracles happen. And clearly all the anger that the rabbi showed and that they showed through his student that he had taught was just all very disturbing. And the redeeming quality of the film for me was what other people have said, the fact that two men can love each other through all this and did in the end. That made me happier with the message of the movie. I guess, I don't know, I guess that's all I needed to say.
Yeah.
I appreciate listening to everyone.
Thanks for being here. For me, I mean, there's plenty of hypocrisy in the Orthodox Jewish world, particularly today. I mean, more so than ever, right? So maybe we shouldn't totally see it through the lens of the moment, where orthodoxy has gotten more and more orthodox in a sense, more and more. There used to be a very vibrant sort of modern orthodoxy. We saw it some in the movie some of us watched last week, The Chosen, that is largely disappearing from the Orthodox world. The Orthodox world is being replaced by the ultra-Orthodox world. And that's where we get the men who won't ride on the same bus with a woman in Israel. And, so
I was just gonna say, most telling in Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of that stuff, that's, I mean, when he tells that little joke at the end about sitting next to a woman on a train, a lot of the Orthodox that I know today would not sit next to a woman on a train,
Nowhere near.
So so times have changed, even in what we would call the ultra-Orthodox community. I mean, it's just has become more and more strident in those things. So we maybe shouldn't see it entirely through that lens. But as I say, I think the movie tries to be fair to both of them in a certain sense. And where I see that is in some lines like when they're talking about the Shoah and what happened, and the Rebbe says, "If I knew God, I'd be God." Right? In other words, if I could understand what this was, and that's a place of humility that we don't hear that often these days in the ultra-Orthodox community. It doesn't come from a place of humility anymore. But that humility of, I don't understand, I'd like to understand, but I can't understand. I'm just human. And of course, the author's response, right, is if I knew God, I'd put him on trial. Which is, we can understand that point of view too. There's no humility in that point of view, right? So they're really coming out. This question that comes out of the Shoah for a lot of people is, how can you believe after the Shoah? And the other side of that is, how can you not believe after the Shoah? And that's the confrontation that they have.
Elaine has a comment or question.
So I must just be a victim or a product of the times of now, because watching this movie was just annoying. I mean, it was like listening to a 2-hour-long argument, like as if my relatives were in the other room arguing. And it just was, I just didn't have a lot of patience for it. I also am in Carla's camp with my feelings towards people who want to live in the Stone Age, and was offended when the woman went to shake his hand and he wouldn't shake her hand. And I know that's a thing, but I find that really offensive. And so it was just, I don't know who would, it's really good to hear this discussion and get another viewpoint on it, because I was so done with this.
Okay, well, that's fine. I imagine you're not persuaded with my idea that maybe you should see it again.
No.
But I will say, like I said at the start, that having watched it several times, I mean, it starts to sneak up on you in a certain way, and that I've come to appreciate. So, but we've seen a lot of movies together. Some are better than others, right? And we don't all have the same opinions about them. So,
And speaking of other movies, next week's movie, The Big Fix from 1978, is very hard to find. And I found it on YouTube for free, but it's not a great, and I'm going to put it in the.
Actually, there's 2 versions up on YouTube, Vanessa. I found one that was good and one that was bad.
Okay. So then
find a good one.
Right.
But there was, at least 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, when we were putting the list together, there was a good version on YouTube.
Okay.
And that's the only place I could find it as well.
Right. All right.
YouTube.
Oh my God. Yeah, this looks 100% better. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Good job, Rabbi.
Yeah. So, so that one's from 1978. If nothing else, I'm pretty sure you'll be entertained by that one. It stars Richard Dreyfuss. It's actually directed by Jeremy Kagan, who directed The Chosen 3 or 4 years later. So, it's kind of an update of like the old sort of Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe kind of movies, but with a Jewish private eye. So not a comedy per se, although there's some comic moments, but just an interesting take on those kinds of movies. So I hope you like it. I do think that there's a lot to take apart in this movie, and the more you see it, the more you get. And I literally have 7 pages of notes from the scenes in the quarrel. So the story of the Lithuanian woman who smuggled Jews out of the Vilna ghetto and hid them and saved Jewish books, even though she's an atheist, right? Is really interesting too. Why did she do it? She believes in human beings and loves them. That's what this comes down to me, is this very sort of human question about this, is that can we as human beings learn to love each other, right? Not because of God, not necessarily because of our particular religious faith, although the Jewish faith tries to teach us to do this, but simply because we're human and we should behave as human beings, right? In the sayings of our ancestors, Rabbi Hillel says, in a place where there are no human beings, strive to be one, right? And that strikes me as a way of perhaps summing up this movie. So Well,
I
with that,
think
I'm
it's-
gonna have to go. It's good to
Right.
see you all. We'll see you next week.
Right. Chag Sameach, have a good Pesach.
Yes.
If you need a Seder, we have a virtual one with Rabbi Ike. Please look at your Makom at home, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you all for
Thank
great
you.
Bye.
All right.